So at this point, we're ready to move into part 2 of our penetration, access, and compromise series of methodology components. Basically, at this point, we're going to go ahead and assume that we have compromised the system using the various methods that we talked about before. And at this point, we're ready to do different things with the privileges that we've gained. So we're going to look to gain critical information, further expand our access, or whatever the case may be. So with that theory in mind, we're going to focus in on session hijacking. And even though session hijacking can often be used for the initial penetration phase, I'm actually focusing on it as part of the maintaining and expanding access. The reason I'm doing that is because of the dynamics of session hijacking. You almost have to place yourself between the user and the resource in order to be effective in that session hijacking process. Now, there are some exceptions there. We'll talk more about that later. We're also going to talk about privilege escalation. What that means is we may not be satisfied with the level of privileges that we've gained. So we might want to elevate those privileges and try to do more things. In addition, we're going to talk about maintaining and expanding access, which is kind of a general overview of some different methods we can use to keep access to our system and potentially expand access. And finally, we're going to talk about system compromise. Now, the term penetration and compromise are often used interchangeably, but simply hacking into a system is definitely not the same thing as compromising that system or taking that system over. So we'll focus in a little bit there as well. So to start things off, we're going to talk about session hijacking. And basically, this is also known as a man-in-the-middle attack. And the idea is we wait for the user to go ahead and perform their regular routine of authentication and accessing the resource, and then we jump in and we take over that session that user has established with that resource or that server or website or whatever the case may be. This basically involves intercepting, monitoring, and recording those sessions for potential playback or compromise of the account or the session itself. Often, it can be used to intercept logon credentials. So basically, we place ourselves in there and we force the data to route through us, and we steal that information as it passes across our network cards, ultimately resulting in potential password leaks or other information confiscation. We can also use this to take over the session between the server and the client. Now, here's the cool thing about that. Why bother with authentication when you can let the real client do it for you? So user A logs onto his workstation for a day's work, and he opens up his web browser to go to the mortgage access system. User A types in his username and his password to access the mortgage system, and then it says the page cannot be displayed. In the user's mind, he's thinking, well, it must have been an error with the server, when in fact, a hacker has taken over the session right after he authenticated. So now the server, the secure mortgage access server, thinks that the hacker has just authenticated using user A's credentials. So user A retypes the URL and reauthenticates and goes on about his business as usual, not knowing that he's recreated a different session and the hacker is still maintaining the original session. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every time you get a page cannot be displayed error right after authentication that you've been hacked, but that's one of the indications. Data can also be intercepted, modified, and retransmitted. And that's actually the overall definition of how you perform a man-in-the-middle or session overstep attack. So I want to go through a quick demonstration here of how this process is going to take place. So under normal circumstances, a user or a client is going to send authentication credentials, such as the username and the password, across the wire. And normally the username and the password is submitted, the server comes back with an OK, and the user actually sends traffic back and forth between the two systems. Well, if we look at a man-in-the-middle attack and the way that's actually going to work for us, it operates quite differently. So let's say, for example, the user has been compromised by the attacker, and the attacker has established an open session with the server. So what happens is the user, either sending over the wire or inadvertently redirecting its traffic to the attacker, submits its username and password information. The attacker pulls it off the wire, reads it, saves it, and then forwards the user onto the server. So this is one example where the user would have never known their information has been stolen because they authenticated normally, no errors, and continue to work. In another scenario, the user sends their username and logon information across the wire, and because the attacker is paying very close attention to what's passing, he actually grabs it off the wire and pulls it back and saves it. And then once the session is established, the attacker jumps in, kicks the user out, and redirects the session from the server back to the hacker. This allows us to effectively kick the user out of the session process, and the server thinks that user A, for example, is actually on this machine and talking normally between the two systems. So I'd like to take a moment and show you an example of how this works.